Good afternoon, צהריים טובים, добрый день, buongiorno.
First of all, I would like to thank the Russian Jewish Congress.
Thank to the Russian Jewish Congress for having this outstanding conference, especially Yuri Kanev, the president of the Russian Jewish Congress, the CEO, Anna Bolshinskaya, the chairman, Michael Friedman, the whole bureau members. And I would like to welcome everybody for this, one of the most important panels of this conference. Why it's the one with the most important panels is because it deals with education, and education to fight xenophobia and promote tolerance and to fight anti-Semitism. And in the long run, the only way to deal with these issues is obviously through education. We have one of the most professional and prominent speakers on this panel. And first of all, I would like really to set the ground rules for what is going to happen. We'll have a keynote address from Professor Alexander Asmolov. We'll give him 10 minutes, and then each one of the speakers will have their own perspectives on the subject we're dealing with. And each one of you will have up to 5 minutes. After everybody speaks, we'll open it for questions and for the remarks and for the inputs from the panel itself. So before, to make it more efficient, I'll present all our panelists just at the beginning, and then we'll moderate it. And if any questions will come in, I'll refer them to specific participants on the panel. It's a little bit a complicated panel from the technical point of view, because it will be conducted both in English, Russian, and Italian with the translation, and hopefully it will work. So I'll start with Professor Alexander Asmolov. I don't think he's one of the people that really needs no introduction. He's a well-known worldwide educator, professor of psychology, head of the Faculty of Psychology of Personality at Moscow State University, formerly first Deputy Minister of Education of Russia, a person who introduced many reforms in the Russian educational system, a very old friend and the president of Old Russia. Then Karel Fragapane. Karel is a program coordinator and specialist of educational sector of UNESCO, where he leads activities relating to genocide education and hate speech, including countering anti-Semitism in the context of UNESCO's work. Before that, Karel served as a policy officer at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and as the head of the Department of International Relations of the Shoah Memorial in Paris. He was also first executive secretary of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA, whom all of we know, of course, very well. Svetlana Tikhankina is PhD in philosophy, honorary worker of general education, and since 2016, head of educational programs of the Holocaust Center in Moscow. Sue Happel, a well-known public speaker and lecturer. She serves as a co-president of the Melbourne Jewish Holocaust Center and is a member of the National Archives of Australia Advisory Council. Sue has been recognized for her teaching and community services by receiving numerous awards, including Medal of Order of Australia for service to the community through promotion and understanding of tolerance. Sue currently serves as 2021 chair of the Educational Working Group for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA. Lilia Komisarenko, director of the Municipal Budgetary Education Institution, Lyceum number 23, with the Jewish component. A deputy of the Legislative Assembly of Jewish Autonomous Region, and she exercises the powers of non-permanent basis. Professor Milena Santillini, Italian Special Representative on Anti-Semitism. Milena is a professor at Catholic University in Milan. Mrs. Santorini was a member of the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly from 2013 to 2018 and rapporteur on combating anti-racism and intolerance. She is currently in charge of report of the Italian government on promoting and strengthening the fight against anti-Semitism in Italy and of the implementation of IRA non-binding definition of anti-Semitism. And last but not the least, Professor Alexei Kalinin, who is professor of business practice, director of the Skolkovo Institute for Emerging Market Studies, at Moscow School of Management in Skolkovo. Alexei is a professor of business practice with the Moscow School in Skolkovo, as I said, and director of the Skolkovo Institute for Emerging Market Studies. Alexei studied strategy and international business at Said Business School at the University of Oxford, BI Norwegian Business School, Graduate School of Business at Moscow State University, as well as the specialist programs by Keio University and Ayoma Gakuin University in Japan. And from here, let's start rolling. Professor Asmolov, is it, in your opinion, in 2021, can we speak about, still speak about multiculturalism? And can we speak about promotion and education for tolerance?
Each time when we meet in Zoom, and we're using the Russian word «изумляемся», meaning wondering. It sounds like Zoom. I think that everybody can see and hear me now. And now I'm happy to greet all my colleagues. I'm happy that the third conference, Protecting the Future, is already underway. And in my presentation, I would like to emphasize several points on multiculturalism, tolerance, and anti-Semitism. My first point is the methodology and philosophy of the issue. As I said during the previous conferences, I can repeat it still today, we cannot take a look at the problem of anti-Semitism outside of the general issue of xenophobia and tolerance. To me, this narrows down our understanding. That's why the key issue for me is the methodology, the question of the understanding of the other as a value from the point of view of cultural anthropology, and the practice of destroying diversity, of destroying otherness, should be realized as a problem, and it should be counterbalanced with the practice of supporting the other, tolerance and multiculturalism. That's why the key issue is methodology, the existential question. If we put ourselves into pigeonholes and stereotypes, if we just consider the phenomenology and facts without considering the evolution and the sources of these troubles, we will be fighting a losing battle. That's why any program of tolerance and preventing xenophobia, for me, means a program of supporting diversity. Tolerance is supporting diversity. Xenophobia is elimination of diversity. And this is what we always have to be realizing and practicing. My second point, as always, when we are talking about protecting the future, this is important and necessary, and this third conference is the proof of it. But, dear all, when I'm talking about protecting and defending something, I'm reacting in my behavior. It's not a proactive behavior. As soon as I'm starting to talk in the terms of protection and defending, this is retreating. And to me, this is a losing strategy. That's why, while discussing these problems at the conference, I would like to repeat to everyone, we're talking about building the future, constructing the future as the culture of decency, when the opportunity of being an other is possible. We are constructing the future, not just protecting it. That's the strategy that we need. In this constructing the future, we need to realize that the memory of Holocaust, the memory that we have to preserve, is the object of struggle today, especially among young people. And when we are fighting for preserving the memory among the youth, we should realize that we're living in a world of redundant information. And in a situation of redundant information, we should try and attract attention to the problem of the Holocaust among the youth. There have been projects dedicated to this. For example, in Israel, we had the project Magia Have, memory of Eve or Hava. It showed this girl, Eve, who perished in Auschwitz, and it was showing how she would have communicated if she had Instagram. The question is, when we talk about the Holocaust, about memory and tolerance, how can we use contemporary formulas and technologies? It's not in the beginning was the word, it's not in the beginning was the deed, in the beginning was the network. When we discuss this, how can we use media technologies for working with memory to bridge the gap between the past and the present? How can we achieve for the young generation, as Romhe has said, the young generation always carries rules of disorder, and if we do not speak the language of the youth, if we do not use new media for information about the Holocaust and the tragedies of this time, we will not be heard, loudly enough, and we will lose the connection between the times. The key question is not just multiculturalism and tolerance. It's a Shakespearean question of time being out of joint. The question is how to build a dialogue between generations through education. How can we build a partnership with the coming generations through education, starting from the ages of 5 or 10 and going on. This is the key issue for today, and those who do not focus their attention on this question of understanding are fighting a losing battle, because the key pains of our time, the deficiencies of our time, are the three deficiencies: deficiency of understanding, deficiency of meaning, and deficiency of trust. Only keeping in mind these value deficiencies, we can spread the knowledge and discuss the ideology of tolerance as the ideology of supporting diversity. And we can use contemporary technologies to preserve memory through these new opportunities. In immersive theater, immersive technologies, this makes this memory living, a memory that happens here and now. And only then will we be able to create new value attitudes among the youth about the fact that everybody has a name, as is mentioned in Yad Vashem. Everything that happened at that point of time is still happening to us here and now. And when we keep in mind the principle, in the beginning was the network, if we use these opportunities to transform contemporary memory mechanisms, to leave digital traces of these events, literally, then it will be a unique step forward. When I say this, I am using the principles from the presentation titled Digital Technologies and the Link Between Times. Each individual has their own network, and here I'm following a thinker who is very close to me, my son, who is now active in London, Grigory Asmolov. And so, here in my talk, I am making this link between times and generations and showing how we are learning from the new generations. It's not just us being their teachers, they are our teachers as well, and we should all realize this. Not just our children, but also our grandchildren who are sent to us, as they joke, to punish our parents. Dear all, I want to emphasize this once again. And what's more, I can say that there are programs like this, for example, the art of living with different people, art of tolerance, art of diversity, and many other anthropological practices that help us to see the other. To conclude my brief presentation, I would like to repeat the words of Goethe that I repeat as a mantra. Genocide is never against somebody. Genocide is always against everyone. And this formula is very relevant for our communication today. This is the existential principle without which we are only defending and watching the barbaric hordes of this world destroying diversity, because barbarity is the tyranny against diversity, is elimination of diversity. Without this principle, we will only be defending and protecting and building fortresses, creating those fortresses around ourselves and only thinking about defending against the surrounding barbarians. But this is the wrong strategy. Only a proactive strategy of changing the reality from the culture of usefulness to culture of decency is the value vector for future development. I am grateful for being able to talk here, to share my love and my ideas with everybody present here. Thank you very much. Thank you, Robert. And I'm really happy to see my brother here on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Professor Asmolov. Professor Asmolov devoted most of his life to fight for these values and to promote them. And as I said, he's one of the worldwide leaders on these issues. And the question really, how we take really the main points that he emphasized in his presentation, and how do we bring it to international level? And obviously the main network that deals with the promotion of different values in educational systems is, of course, UNESCO. We live in difficult times, and maybe if we'll have enough time, I'll give some data about what's happening today in the world, both in the fields of Islamophobia, Xenophobia, and mainly anti-Semitism that this conference is focusing on. But Karel, I would like to hear from you, really, the UNESCO perspective, the global perspective, how you take these values and how you implement them in formal educational systems. When I was the CEO of the World Jewish Congress, we had together one of the programs, but it's much more than that. And you're representing the global organization that is actually responsible to fight all these causes. And it will be interesting to know, to take from what Professor Asmolov said and see how this can be implemented or is implemented in formal educational systems and national curriculums worldwide.
Thank you, Robert, for this introduction. Thank you, Professor Asmolov, for your very wise words of introduction to this interesting panel. Ladies and gentlemen and excellencies, I'm very, very honored to participate in this panel devoted to discussing current education about the Holocaust and education against intolerance and discrimination. And I really want to thank the Russian Jewish Congress for inviting me and UNESCO to be part of it. I was asked to talk about this subject, but with some focus on what UNESCO is doing on education about the history of the Holocaust. So I will take it from there. And I will start by saying that for UNESCO, learning about the Holocaust is not exclusively a matter of historical education. Obviously, the Holocaust is not like any other topic. It's really, and I think this is very much in line with what Mr. Asmolov was saying just now, it's really about trying to understand how ideologies of hatred take root, how violence can permeate the society, and how fragile democratic institutions can be. From an educational perspective, it is about building resilience of young people to messages that seek to divide and to exclude, and to help them become more critical thinkers, responsible and active global citizens who value human dignity and respect for all. So these objectives really sit at the core of UNESCO's mandate to build peace in the minds of men and women, which is why the organization is deeply committed to promoting education about the Holocaust as part of our overall work on global citizenship education, which, as you know, is a priority for the United Nations system. And indeed, as new global challenges and threats to peace emerge, so must our educational systems be better prepared to meet new needs. Education about the Holocaust, considering the universal implications of this history and its importance in shaping today's world, has an important role to play in this regard. And I would like to raise 2 points as to why it is important for UNESCO to prioritize education about the Holocaust and why we promote it to our member states. First of all, obviously, and I think likewise in the spirit of what Professor Asmolov was saying, because it strongly resonates with contemporary challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic has illuminated, in particular, the persistence of deeply rooted prejudice and conspiracy theories about the Jewish community in particular that are reminiscent of the hate propaganda that flourished under the Nazi regime. We know from history that these hateful attitudes do not always end with words and rhetoric, but translate into threats and violence. And I think that Holocaust education has a fundamental role to play in this respect, because education that takes heed of the hateful ideologies that enabled persecution during the Nazi regime can sharpen young people's critical thinking against violent extremism today, whatever form of violent extremism, and hate speech. As we know, it manifests itself online as well as offline, because education that raises awareness of the decisions that were made by individuals, by political movements, and by governments who contributed to the genocide of the Jewish people, or more exceptionally, raising awareness of the decisions that were made by people who resisted or protected the victims, can promote young people's constructive political and ethical engagement in their society. And indeed, this is one of the big challenges of education. It's not only about imparting knowledge, it's also about promoting engagement and positive and responsible engagement in society. And this is why I think Holocaust education can profoundly contribute to the objectives of global citizenship education. In other words, the history of the Holocaust strongly resonates with today's world and provides deep insights to the challenges of our time. And this is the basis of our engagement with member states and with other organizations, such as the IRA, here represented by Sue and Paul. Second, because on a global level, and yes, indeed, UNESCO, the United Nations, it is, you cannot do more global, especially in regions that are remote from the areas where the genocide of the Jewish people took place and other Nazi crimes took place. Holocaust education provides context to deal with the history of violent pasts broadly, and it can help also contribute to the prevention of genocide. And this is an argument that we are putting forward to member states when we go beyond the places where the genocide took place. We indeed believe at UNESCO that understanding the historical dynamics of violent past and the study of the Holocaust is a guidepost in that respect, is fundamental in forming positive social identities and better intergroup relations, in fostering dialogue. And I think this is very important when we talk about education about the Holocaust, dialogue about how the past is taught and remembered, and about how official discourses about the past emerge, how they intertwine with the different discourses that are in the society, the different narratives that emerge in the society. And it is important in terms of coming to terms with divisive stereotypes that have fed hate speech, incitement, and contributed to the emergence of violence. So UNESCO has been promoting this particular approach for some years now through a program that we call the International Program on Holocaust Education, on Holocaust and Genocide Education, that we're promoting with the US Holocaust Memorial Museum to promote genocide education globally. We're working in particular in regions and in countries where education about the Holocaust is not well developed. To finish, Robert, I would like to raise 2 points of warning. First of all, that Holocaust education is not the solution to combat anti-Semitism. It is only a part of it. Education about the Holocaust is obviously, as I just said, extremely important for the reasons I just exposed. But one should remain aware that it's not an adequate substitute for education against anti-Semitism today. If anti-Semitism is exclusively addressed through Holocaust education, then learners might conclude that anti-Semitism is not an issue of today. They might misconceive its contemporary form. So it is important to actually develop, and this is what UNESCO has done, a specific, separate program on contemporary anti-Semitism, including the development of guidelines and workshops for policymakers, for teacher trainers, for school directors about addressing anti-Semitism through education, which means understanding anti-Semitism throughout history, not only the Holocaust, but obviously also the Holocaust, but also in education. How do you help teachers address manifestations of anti-Semitism when they occur in the classroom? And this is a work that we've been doing now for some years together with the OSCE, ODIHR, and with the World Jewish Congress. And we recently organized workshops for Russia, Caucasus, the Caucasus region, and Central Asia with our regional office. And the second point I wanted to add to conclude is that, and I think this is a priority for today in terms of Holocaust education, but also in terms of addressing anti-Semitism, is that educators must be empowered to address the problem of Holocaust distortion. For me, this should be a priority at the moment. The memory of the Holocaust is indeed increasingly exploited and manipulated on social media to generate emotive responses, particularly at moments of public fear, anxiety, and anger, just like we know now with the pandemic and its catastrophic consequences throughout the world. But in particular, it is also exploited by political forces, national political forces, who wish to erase the most uncomfortable part of their past, especially trying to shirk responsibilities of local populations in the perpetration of the genocide alongside Nazi Germany. So Holocaust education is a real challenge in that respect, because it erodes progressively, slowly, viciously, I would say, our understanding of this history, and it nourishes conspiracy theories, it nourishes extreme nationalism, it nourishes also Holocaust denial, and it builds on, let's not forget it, it builds on and it feeds anti-Semitism. And in that respect, it can be dangerous. Professor Asmolov said it earlier. I mean, in a way, it's just the tip of the iceberg of what education systems are facing. This is naturally related to the broader issue of hate speech, in particular online hate speech, in a climate in which scientific knowledge is delegitimated, in a climate of mistrust towards political institutions and scientific institutions, and in a context in which conspiracy theories, including anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, are spreading. So this raises new challenges for educators, for which we must devise new pedagogies. And I will finish on that, Robert. The UN and Unesco, for instance, are publishing in a few weeks a research study on Holocaust distortion on social media, together with the World Jewish Congress. We're preparing guidelines for educators. We also worked very closely with the World Jewish Congress under your leadership to create a website with basic information about the Holocaust called aboutholocaust.org, which has given rise to an agreement with Facebook, whereby Facebook redirects its users that are searching for terms related to Holocaust denial, Holocaust distortion. Like if you type Holo hoax, for instance, in your Facebook search function, this will lead you to the website that was developed by the World Jewish Congress and UNESCO. So what I want to say here to conclude is that Holocaust distortion is a priority because it does affect deeply our understanding of the Holocaust, of the nature of the crime, of the importance of the crime, of the implications of those crimes, and still the implications that they have for today. It's a threat for education and research. It is an insult to the memory of Holocaust victims and survivors. And beyond, and this is why it is so important, I would say, worldwide, it is a sign of erosion of critical thinking and of the quality of the democratic debate, which reinforces, in turn, the conditions of insecurity of Jewish communities in particular. And for all these reasons, I think we must seriously tackle the problem. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Karol. And the perspective you gave us from UNESCO is extremely important. I'm actually proud that I was at the beginning of this project together with you when I was in the World Jewish Congress. But I would like to commend UNESCO for taking very strong leadership on this issue. To commend you personally, the Director General Audrey Azoulay, because I think that the last few years, the impact that UNESCO had in different national ministries of education is enormous. And I fully agree with you, and I'm sure that the other speakers will speak about this, that the Holocaust memory distortion is now kind of an urgent priority. Before moving to our next speaker, just to complete what you said with the some factual data that was just published by the EU when they published their big new plan to fight anti-Semitism, 1 of 20 Europeans never heard about Holocaust. In other words, every fifth citizen in the European Union never heard about the Holocaust, and we're talking now about only 80 years since we just commemorated the Babi Yar and the Holocaust by bullets. And here today on the streets of Europe, every fifth citizen never heard about this, and 43% of Europeans think it's sufficiently taught in the schools, and as we understand from the first figure, it doesn't work together. And 62% of Jews have seen or heard of non-Jewish people suggesting that Holocaust is a myth and never happened. So from this point, this panel is actually, and I have to commend the Russian Jewish Congress, because we have here really an international view from different perspectives. We have here the view of UNESCO, Australia, Italy, European view, but also the Russian one. And from here, we're moving to Svetlana Tikhankina. And Svetlana, I would like in the 5 minutes that you have to speak about Holocaust education in the Russian Federation that is co-hosting this conference, and give us really the perspective of what's happening in your country, but also dealing with what Karol spoke about the Holocaust memory distortion, not only teaching about the Holocaust, but also how do you deal actually with the distortion and with different groups that work in this context. We can't hear you.
Good afternoon, all. Indeed, today during the plenary, we talked a lot about the fact that to prevent anti-Semitism, we need to study Holocaust. And our center that has been engaging in over 30 years on the issue of promoting this in areas of education. We train the trainers how to talk about Holocaust. So for us, this is a burning issue. And I would dwell on some of the issues related to our conference. 17 years ago, the educational standards implied the term Holocaust, and in the 9th grade, the Nazi occupational regime was one of the topics of study, a mandatory topic, but it was not mandatory for monitoring, so not part of the school leaving exams. It all depended on the teacher, on how serious he was about talking this topic for children to understand this, not only hear the term. The problem is that the textbooks do have this terminology, but still they would have a lot of mistakes in relating the material. There's a very loose interpretation of this term when victims of Holocaust include the Russians, the Slavs, the prisoners of war. So what's behind this term is up for a teacher or a student to figure out. So if this teacher doesn't know much about this, he just wouldn't start talking about this. If he has very poor knowledge of this, why would he relate this to others? Perhaps this is a right approach, but still, the Holocaust Center provides workshops, and in over 30 years we've held about 300 workshops, and it's increasing thanks to the spread of the internet. Anyways, we have only limited resources in spreading this information. Even upon the outcomes of our workshop, we ask the listeners, what is Holocaust? What have you understood from a 3-day workshop? And the stereotypes that are already imbued and seated there deeply, they would still say that Holocaust is about the annihilation of Jews, the people from Poland, and so on. And when there is no understanding of the term, then the tragedy is also related in a very loose terms, and they cannot understand why anti-Semitism led to Holocaust, why it has become fundamental to Holocaust, and it's impossible to explain this in one lesson. So the lessons learned from Holocaust is the fact that it gave an example of such drastic evil when a person is killed just because he was born like this, why he was born different. This is an inexplicable example of evil. Or sometimes we talk about how people sacrifice their own lives to save others. So during our lessons, we say maybe it's not that important to remember all of the dates, figures, and information, but rather to learn about the moral of Holocaust, when there are foretellers who would tell about occupational regimes in the Soviet Union and what was the difference between it and other regimes. So in the regions that used to be under the occupation, that had their own regional history, that have sites related to tragedy, as well as regions that were far from Holocaust, that cannot think that it is part of their history. So there, we also hold projects with the Russian Jewish Congress that is called Deed Despite, about the righteous people. And there's a lot of examples of some righteous attitude toward others when people were sacrificing their own families, their own selves to save others. And everyone would understand this example. And it's important for children to be cited such examples when teachers saved students.
Or students saved their teacher, even if they were not loving this teacher for boring lessons and so on, but they do reach out their helping hand when the crisis comes and hide their teacher and protect them, even when they're offered rewards for giving them up. We also have the project The Witnesses, with 3 films. It's a cinematic project. The 3 films are aimed at various audiences, ages up to 12, to 14, to 16. And they can be watched in order. They bring about more knowledge about the Holocaust, and they are summarized in the 3rd film, The Violin, by Konstantin Ham. He discovered the truths about the Holocaust and showed them in his film, and it can be used to show the students this information. The next project, The Liberators, has been running for 19 years, supported by the Presidential Grants Program. Who are the liberators? These are the Red Army soldiers who were liberating the ghettos. For example, in the city of Kaluga, where people were saved, they were not killed. The Nazis did not have time enough to kill them, and so the prisoners of the ghetto survived. And how it happened from Kaluga to Terezin, concentration camps from which people were saved. Auschwitz, which was liberated on January 27th, 7,000 people were saved from there. And in late January, when we have the Memory Week, we can be talking about these liberators, not just the victims, but also those who risked their lives to save others. And when the prisoners of Auschwitz come together, fortunately there are still survivors with us. They always thank the 100th Division who saved them, the Ukrainian front of the Red Army who saved them. And if we remove this date from the calendar, for 5 years it was part of the calendar of educational events at the Ministry of Education. But this year they decided that it's not important, because now we have a new date, April the 19th. the remembrance of the genocide of the Soviet people, the date that has not been ratified. The genocide has not yet been officially recognized, but the date is already there. And so they do not separate the Jews on January the 27th. They do not separate them into a separate date, because this is also the date of remembrance of the siege of Leningrad. I think that the answer that we got from the ministry has to be published in the media and examined as such, because it's a cynical answer, because they are not just disregarding the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, it's also the date of memory for soldiers who liberated the victims. And when the foreign media are talking about the Ukrainians or the Americans liberating people from Auschwitz, only then Russian officials are ready to bring up the data and the historical witnesses. But we will not be able to educate the coming generations if we are not taking this fact into account and not reminding them of this date of liberation. We want to make it a point of stress after this conference to bring back this date into educational work, the date of liberation of Holocaust victims. Thank you so much.
In the Russian Federation, it's extremely important statement, and we have here Karol from Unesco and Sue from IRA, and I'm sure that they will take it also to international level, because no doubt that your words really are coming from heart to heart. Sue, you have here two heads. You are representing the Australian Jewish community, and would like so it's a challenge to do both in 5-6 minutes. But we would like to know, it's a big difference of what Svetlana presented, because in Russia there's almost no family that didn't lose somebody during the Second World War, and definitely there is no Jewish family that didn't lose somebody during the war. And it's a little bit different when it comes to a place like Australia, and would like really to know how the Holocaust is taught in Australia. But you're also having the portfolio of Holocaust education in IRA, which has a global portfolio. So I know what I'm asking you to do is impossible in 5-6 minutes to give us both. But I think that things that were raised by Professor Asmolov and the Karol from Unesco and Svetlana really are calling for you to deal with both issues. So please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Drost Wojcia, and good evening from Australia. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I feel very honoured to be part of this distinguished panel, and it would have been wonderful to be in Moscow with you all. And thank you, Professor Asmolov and Robert and Karel, Svetlana, for your very important contributions to our discussion today. I'll be telling you a little bit about Holocaust education in Australia and what we are doing to combat hate speech and distortion. And I'd also like to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing at IRA in 5 or 6 minutes. So for those of you who don't know, it's interesting to know a little bit about Australia. So Australian Jews have been in Australia since 1788, since the very first fleet when the British came to Australia. And that number started to grow in 1938-39 when 35,000 Jewish refugees and Holocaust survivors found a safe haven in our land. Australia has actually accepted more Holocaust survivors per capita than any other nation except for Israel. So by the early 1960s, 60% of our Jewish Australian population were either Holocaust survivors or children of Holocaust survivors. So we are very much a vibrant community of about 120,000 people today, only 0.5% of the population. But in spite of our small number, we are vibrant and an integral part in the fabric of Australian society. So, and Holocaust survivors started the museums that we have also in Australia, which I'll talk more about in a minute. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we're doing with Holocaust education and best practices that the Australian government is doing when it comes to Holocaust education and remembrance and research, and especially what we're doing to educate against hate speech and discrimination. So I think that Australia took quite a serious response once Australia officially became member of the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and showed their very strong commitment to these values. And it shows how relevant and pertinent Holocaust education is to civic values in Australian society. Now, a couple of examples I want to tell you about. This year, the Australian government has announced funding for new Holocaust museums in every single state and territory throughout Australia. That's Perth and Adelaide and Canberra, Hobart and Brisbane, and additional funding for the two largest Holocaust centres that have been existing for a while in Sydney and Melbourne. So it's actually going to mean by 2024 that every single state will have a Holocaust museum or a Holocaust education centre. And the federal government supports this, all our state governments support it. And the Treasurer said, we want school students from every state to learn about the Holocaust, the importance of tolerance and combating racism. I heard before about education in Russia. So education is state-based in Australia, and Holocaust education can only be mandated by state governments. So it's compulsory in the two largest states, which is Victoria and New South Wales. And the other states still teach Holocaust education, but it's not actually mandated. But in Queensland, they are mandating Holocaust education. And I was fortunate to be involved in working with the Victorian Education Department in developing Holocaust curriculum for Year 9 and 10, which I can tell you more about later in Victoria. As Karel has said, and everybody is aware that there is a resurgence of anti-Semitism, and Australia is dealing with this problem as well. And our Prime Minister announced at the recent Malmo Forum that the Australian government is intending to embrace the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, and they want to use it as a tool to evaluate incidents that are reported as anti-Semitism so that schools and universities and workplaces know what anti-Semitism is and therefore are best equipped to deal with it. Another interesting development in Australia is that there has been a lot of people displaying Nazi symbols on public buildings. So they're actually looking at legislation that should be enacted definitely in Victoria and hopefully in the whole of Australia to make the public display of Nazi symbols illegal. So that's being under discussion at the moment. And in order to better understand what do people know about the Holocaust, what are they aware about across Australia, one of the largest surveys ever commissioned has just been undertaken. The Gandel survey is evaluating how much do Australians know. And when we know that, we'll know what are the myths, what are the misperceptions about the Holocaust, and how can we use that knowledge to develop educational initiatives to combat the issues that are encountered. So the findings of that survey will be announced on International Holocaust Remembrance Day on the 27th of January. And I agree with so much that Karel has said about the value of Holocaust education and how lessons of the past can help us deal with these contemporary challenges. And it's clear that quality teaching and learning is one of the answers to combat hatred and deal with racism and xenophobia. But education has to extend beyond the classrooms, obviously to universities, but to cultural and sporting institutions. The Australian government, we're talking a lot now, and at IRA we talked about it, about how we can stop the chants in the stadiums. And in Australia, we're sort of also working in that area. So educating about the Holocaust is one valuable piece of a large puzzle that we will be solving to challenge hatred and discrimination and denial that affects us like locally, nationally and globally. Education has to be broadened, not just how we need to teach students, how do you identify bias? How do you provide students with a skill set of critical thinking that would enable them to distinguish between factual information and disinformation and create informed opinions about historical facts and democratic processes? So you need active engagement by states and companies and civil society and media. And it is undeniable that there has to be quality education. And I'd like to point out that the IRA, and wearing my IRA hat, that our teaching and learning recommendations is actually a fantastic way to leverage educational resources to counter these phenomena and ensure the memory of the Holocaust is never forgotten. And you all might be interested in knowing the recommendations have been translated into 21 languages, including Arabic, but there's nothing in Russian. So if anybody here is interested in having these outstanding educational resources translated into Russian, I know IRA would be very, very happy to do whatever they can to have these resources translated into Russian. Just a couple of more points. It is important to bring about a change in the rhetoric around the Holocaust through our leaders. And I think that it's very important that we look to our leaders. If our leaders make an appropriate use of this history, so too will the broader population, thereby taking national communities further from an honest confrontation with the past and toward a less democratic society. So we need to also understand denial or distortion of history is an assault on truth and memory. Comprehension of the past is the only way to understand ourselves, our society, and our future. So I'm sorry it's been very short, but a little bit about Education Australia and IRA, but I'm happy to answer questions later.
Sue, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for what you are doing, but thank you also for an excellent example of Australia and the Jewish community and your joint work on this issue. I think that the very fact that the decision of the government to establish Holocaust museums in every region, and especially keeping in mind that it's going to be government funded, which will ensure also the proper content of each one of these museums that will be controlled, not by private or NGOs, but really by the government, is very important. And of course, what you said about the compulsory Holocaust education is I think it's very unique. Maybe Carol will speak about this later, but I think it's an excellent example. And of course, I hope that the Russian Federation will jump on board with whatever is concerning IRA, because they are doing a fantastic job on many aspects of Holocaust education. But we hope very much that they will join the IRA and will promote the values that you also raised in your presentation. Now, from here, in the 30s of the last century, there was an attempt to establish a Jewish state in Birobidzhan and the far east of Russia. And we have Lilia from this region. Just to give us, once again, Lilia, very much, I know that we are short on time, in 5 minutes, to give us a presentation about the relations between various nationalities and how Jewish culture and everything that deals with the education, Holocaust education and distortion is being dealt with in Birobidzhan.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Good afternoon. At this conference today, we were talking a lot about the role of education in the shaping of the contemporary individual, about looking for tools in order to prevent xenophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism. We're talking about constructing the future. I would like to quote several successful examples that were achieved in our region, in the Jewish Autonomous Oblast. Our audience is well aware of the fact that intercultural dialogue and intercultural relationships are a foundation for the existence of people in our world. Currently, the Jewish Autonomous Oblast has a full environment that allows for cultural and educational projects that are aimed at inter-ethnic and inter-religious dialogue in the region that allow prevention of xenophobia and extremism. My slides are not being shown for the whole. Next slide, please. Thank you. This environment includes the following structures: the regional government, educational institutions, cultural institutions, ethnic and diasporal organizations. In order to ensure inter-ethnic communication, the government of the region has created a Council on Harmonizing Inter-Ethnic and Inter-Religious Relationships. Its aim is to prevent extremism and terrorism. It comprises representatives of civic organizations, religious organizations, governmental agencies, and regional activists. In 2015, the Civic Chamber created an interreligious council of the region. It comprises representatives of 3 religions: the Birobidzhan Diocese of the Orthodox Church, the Jewish community, and the Muslim community. These 2 councils do not overlap, they complement each other's activity. The Governor's Council works on policy making, while the Interreligions Council works with practical issues, including cultural and educational projects. An important part in this intercultural collaboration is the educational system. For example, the Jewish school number 23 works as a cultural and educational center, as a kind of a center of gravity for citizens in arranging inter-ethnic dialogue. My role as the director of the school and representative of the legislative in the region allows to coordinate the interaction between the government and the society. On the one hand, as an educator, me and my colleagues are working towards creating a friendly environment for both children and adults. And as a member of regional parliament, I have legislative mandate to build the cultural policy of the region. Some examples. In the recent 15 years, the school, together with the Holocaust Center, supported by this educational center, creates workshops and lectures for teachers of the region. The subject is Lessons of Holocaust, Lessons of Memory. The central event in preserving the Holocaust memories in the region is the Week of Memory that was initiated by the Russian Jewish Congress. Next slide, please. The development of this dialogue took steps in the Far Eastern Interreligious Forum, the territory of consensus. On the slide you have all the events and forums within this big program. And here we have one area selected in bold. It was arranged at the school. We arranged several open lessons dedicated to the cultures of various ethnicities represented in the region. The forum encouraged a youth event for interreligious dialogue, and such an event was organized last May.
The motto for this event that brought together 800 people was the spiritual life, increased religious grammar, and the national identity. Next. While preparing for the forum, we tried to involve people of various ethnicities, ages, and specialists from various areas of expertise. Given the background of our target group, we worked on the various activities to involve as many participants as possible. It's probably an old presentation, so we don't have the slide I need. So I'll talk about the areas that we covered in the course of the first Youth Forum, that is national dialogue, introduction into Torah and Talmud for beginners, plenary discussion, ethnic and religious situation in the Jewish autonomous region, debate club, international relations in the Jewish region, autonomous region, workshop, national touch in business, various confessions. How do we help our children to become friends? And the most important one, to end it, was the Festival of National Cultures. And our school was the organizer of this festival. So our school has become a great platform for talented and bright youth that represent the culture and traditions of the peoples living in the territory of the Jewish Autonomous Region. Thus, these mechanisms allow us to coexist in harmonious dialogue. Thank you. Thank you very much. Everything happening in Birobidzhan is always very interesting, and I'm glad that we had an opportunity to listen to your experience. And now, I would like to know about the European aspects on our issues. So Milena Santorini.
The same report that was published by the European Union, it was mentioned that every second European considers anti-Semitism as a problem. And then in the same report, it showed that 38% of Jews considered immigrating from Europe because they do not feel safe as Jews in the countries of the European Union. But mainly would like really to hear from you not only the Italian perspective, of course, mainly the Italian perspective, but also, as you are the only European representative here on the panel, to give us also the European perspective on both on teaching the Holocaust and fighting the distortion of Holocaust, but also on fighting anti-Semitism.
Okay. Thanks, Robert Finger and all colleagues and friends. I speak as Italian commissioner or coordinator for the fight against anti-Semitism, but I have opportunity to speak in Italian. Then I have the opportunity, then I will speak in Italian. 180 erano sul web. Circolano immagini antiche della propaganda nazista, accuse e diffamazione. E quindi, soprattutto con la pandemia, stiamo assistendo a molti episodi di distorsione della Shoah. Ne parlava Karel Fracapane e gli altri. Non si tratta di negazione dell'Olocausto.
So nowadays, there is a lot of distorted information on Shoah, but we're not talking about the neglecting or denying Holocaust. It is rather about the wrong presentation of information.
Molti indossano le casacche dei deportati.
During the demonstration of anti-Semites, they use a lot of symbolism that the Nazis used during the deportation of people to concentration camps like yellow stars. And this, indeed, was spreading online.
Thank you, Professor Santorini. Grazie mille. I think the Italian perspective on this issue was extremely important. There were some technical problems, but I'm sure that this will be sorted out and was sorted out. We're coming to our last speaker, to Professor Kalinin from famous Skolkovo business school. And the question which is asked in many places, we're dealing how business community, which is not the educational community, how it fits in to this important task of fighting xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia, and any other issues that were raised during this session of the conference. So, Professor Kalinin, please.
Спасибо большое. Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги.
Thank you very much. On the one hand, it's an honor to be here, to speak here at such an influential section. On the other hand, I'm quite excited because as a business school, we are on the periphery, because business is just a fraction of the society. But anyway, business education is part of education. So we think that we are in the situation where we can affect what is going on in the heads of business leaders, and then they can influence a great number of people. So we think that on our agenda, we still have room for issues related to tolerance. And now I'll talk about how this works in the best business schools of the world. So the definition of the business school rationale is the cultural intellect. Cultural intelligence, rather. This is something that we started dealing with in the mid of 2010. There were reasons, such as accelerated globalization, and the peak coincided with this, and we shifted from the language of multipolar world. And in business, the key word is still efficiency. So the cultural intelligence in business is the ability to understand cultural differences and to efficiently build interaction within various national cultures. Indeed, first we're talking about, let's say, an American country is entering a Russian market. So how do you build dialogue between two cultures? But in no time, in the context of globalization, this turned into a multicultural dialogue in global companies that have no dominating national culture, or in dominating companies, global companies working across the globe, where you had to understand at the same time many cultures and to be able to work with many cultures in one place. So now I'd like to ask you to show one of the slides that shows a specific business case, as we say, why cultural intelligence is of great importance. Do we have slides here in presentation? No? Okay. No, nothing to worry about. So in a couple of words, about what there was on this slide. So, in the left up corner of this slide, you can see. So, maybe it's better that we don't see this slide, because I showed specific companies making concrete mistakes, but now, without mentioning these companies, maybe I will not offend them. So, as you know, we always want to address each of the consumers separately, and several companies made a mistake of trying to do that through a very well-known phrase, to each his own. This was done in the 90s and 2000 in Austria, Germany and Russia. And every time people release this advertisement campaign, they always receive an appropriate response to this. And then they take this away and remove these advertisements. The first thing that surprises me is that big companies do this. People who have to go through a red tape, and no one in this chain of decision-making ever paid attention to this. So this is a collective cultural failure, cultural intelligence failure. And the second is big scandals, big rows, but then in 2 or 3 years, there is another company starting the same advertisement. So I'm surprised that these people working in the advertisement have no accumulated experience. And then how do they tackle this crisis? So even Cicerone said once about this. So at the second stage of public pressure, they came to know that it was easier to just remove these advertisements and to apologize. It actually saves a lot of money to not to do this. And also, this is a blow delivered to the reputation of each brand. And even business communities feel this strongly. And very often, there's no need to explain why cultural intelligence is important. If we are talking about positive facts, Alexander Grigorievich said that already, that there are things that can be applied to business too. There's such a research in business saying that cross-cultural teams are more innovative than monocultural teams. So business always thinks whether they can monetize this, and if someone supports diversity, then this is the most important function of business. is to facilitate such innovative environments and strategies and concepts. So how do business schools teach this? The most important here is to create an international educational environment. This is an international course students. This is the stuff that has to be international and the international collaborations of this school. For example, in the most authoritative influential ranking published by Financial Times of business schools, everything to do with cultural diversity has a 10% weight in the assessment of each of the business schools. To compare, the most important parameter is the salary of graduates, that is 20% share of this ranking. So without internationalization strategy, a business school cannot even receive its ranking, and this is very important today. It's interesting that American business schools have a 40 to 30% part of the ranking, whereas European schools have a number of 97, 98. So there's certain target programs on how to do business in this or that country. For example, how do you do business in India or China? Programs. So there are also programs for doing business in Israel. And here it is to be mentioned that there are certain stereotypes that serve the interest, that increase interest. For example, people think that Israel is an innovative country with lots of startups, and there are certain books that contribute to this interest, also agriculture, medicine. And these also serve the interest of going with certain business expeditions to Israel and a number of other countries. Besides, the program itself would often have courses on cultural intelligence and certain elements of education programs for students interested in working in multicultural environment across the globe. So for them, it's fundamentally important to understand the nature of cultural intelligence and how to foster it and how to manage it. And the last to be said here is that in business schools, there is an element of self-organization of students when they set up their own clubs according to national or cultural descriptions, and this is with the support of business schools itself. So this self-organization and network-like collaboration is important after the graduation of the students. It's very important for the fabric of business education. This is not something controlled by business school, but rather by student community and business community upon the graduation. So for business schools, this is something that is about cultural intelligence, which is a priority. We're not talking about how much we can tolerate each other. No, rather we talk about how much can we capitalize and monetize by being so different. Thank you.
Once again, I would like to thank Russian Jewish Congress for even thinking of bringing business perspective into this complicated issue, which is not usual for these kind of conferences. And I really think it's extremely important. I just to strengthen what you said about Israel and the startup nation and the innovation in Israel, which basically fuels the economy of this country. And you see Tel Aviv behind me, it more looks like Manhattan these days. And it's thanks to the high-tech and to startup industry here in Israel. And it's basically based on what you just said, on multiculturalism and then the fact that people came to this country from 100 different countries worldwide, bringing different cultures, different languages, and bringing different perception of life and different approaches. So this is very correct. And thank you for your intervention. But once again, thanking the Russian Jewish Congress for even thinking of bringing this issue, the business community, into this subject. I see that Professor Asmolov feels very strongly that he would like to make really half a minute intervention on what was presented earlier about the Holocaust education in Russia. So Professor Asmolov, they are keeping me on time, so you really have the 30 seconds, and please.
It's extremely important what Svetlana described for us. Dates are rejected, dates are removed from history textbooks. I called the Minister for School Education, Mr. Kravtsov, today. He doesn't know about this. He wants to learn more about this and correct this. Already this pragmatic result, if we achieve it, will be important. I wrote to the minister, said that I can't understand this, and I got a reaction. So I would like to hear more from Svetlana with the quotations from the documents that led to this.
If this panel had only this impact, it's already a huge one. And I'm very happy that Professor Asmolov, that you so efficiently dealt with this issue, because obviously it's an extremely important issue. We know how important the Holocaust education for the Russian Federation is and always was. And if things need to be corrected on different working levels, we are very happy to have you on this panel. And I'm sure that the Russian Jewish Congress also will assist Svetlana and yourself in putting this situation through. We more or less, it's for the Jewish conference and for the Jewish panel to finish with 7 speakers on time, being Jewish and non-Jewish on this panel. It's an achievement by itself, and we are just we are right on time. But as always, if there is a place, I hear from Moscow that the hall is full despite the COVID, and the conference room is full. So if there is one question from the room, Anna Bolshitskaya, I'm very happy to take it, but please direct it to a specific participant. Is there any question from the conference room? Okay, so we will, whatever questions there are, please send it to the Russian Jewish Congress, and I'm sure they will forward it to people participated in this panel. I would like really to thank very much for everybody who took part in this panel, not only for your participation here, but for everything you are doing during the year. I think all of us have a very important task, and I think from everything that was said here, I think we are directly straight on time. I would like to take this opportunity, and I'll read it in Russian,
to express my gratitude to the informational partners of this section, the website mel.fm on educational practice.
Together with us, gave all the media sponsorship to the whole conference and specifically to this session. And I would like to conclude by saying once again that to fight anti-Semitism, there's an issue of recognition, there's the issue of definition, there's the issue of the legislation, there's the issue of law enforcement. But I think that all of us agree, not only people on this conference, but generally, that the only way to deal with these issues on the long term and strategically is through education. And this is the opportunity that all of us had during this conference. I know that thousands of people are watching it, and tens of thousands will have an opportunity to watch it later. So I would like once again to thank everybody, to thank once again the media sponsor, the Russian Jewish Congress, for putting it together. Thank you.